11-year-old girl walks into hospital holding a baby. When she reveals who the father is, panic ensues. Sarah's small, trembling figure entered the hospital unnoticed at first, her gaze fixed on the bundle in her arms. She was just 11 years old, yet her face held a determination that seemed far beyond her years. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. The infant she carried squirmed, letting out a weak cry, and Sarah pulled him closer, shielding him from the cool, sterile air. It was well past midnight, and the fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway cast long shadows as she walked. She felt each heartbeat pounding in her chest, pushing her forward, urging her to ask for help despite the terror that gripped her. The nurses behind the reception desk finally noticed her, exchanging confused glances. She looked much too young to be holding a newborn on her own, let alone at this hour. One of the nurses, a tall woman with kind eyes, stepped forward cautiously. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" she asked, bending down to Sarah's eye level. But Sarah just shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. I need to see a doctor. "The baby, he's not okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital's machinery. The nurse glanced at the bundle in Sarah's arms, noticing how pale and quiet the baby seemed. Without another word, she led Sarah to a nearby examination room, her own heart pounding with worry and curiosity. Who was this girl? And where were her parents? "The doctor will be here soon," the nurse said gently, her voice soothing, as she took the baby from Sarah's arms. "You did the right thing bringing him here." Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears she fought to hold back. She felt empty without the baby in her arms, as though she had just handed over the last piece of herself. When the doctor arrived, he took the baby from the nurse, his expression growing serious as he began to assess the infant's condition. Sarah sat on the edge of the examination table, her small hands twisting together anxiously. She watched the doctor's every move, her eyes darting between him and the baby. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle as he glanced over at her. "Sarah," she replied, her voice so soft that he had to lean in to hear her. "My name is Sarah." The doctor studied her for a moment, taking in her youthful appearance and the worry etched into her face. "Sarah, whose baby is this?" he asked carefully, choosing his words with the delicacy required for talking to a child. Sarah's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers trembling as they clutched the fabric of her shirt. She knew this question was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Mine," she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. The doctor felt his breath catch, his mind racing as he processed what she had said. He glanced at the nurse, who looked equally stunned, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. The doctor returned his gaze to Sarah, his expression softening as he knelt down to her level. "Sarah, can you tell me how old you are?" he asked gently, trying to understand the gravity of what she was saying. "I'm 11, she replied, her voice trembling but resolute. There was a heartbreaking strength in her tone, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. He took a deep breath, glancing at the baby in his arms, who now lay silent, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "And the baby's father? Can you tell me who he is?" he asked softly, hoping to tread carefully on such fragile ground. But Sarah flinched, her eyes widening with fear, and she shook her head vigorously. "I can't tell you that," she whispered, hugging herself tightly as if trying to ward off the question. I just need you to help him. Please. That's all." The doctor exchanged a look with the nurse, both realizing that they were dealing with a situation far more complex and painful than they had anticipated. "Of course, we're going to help him," he assured her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But Sarah, if you're in any kind of danger, or if someone hurt you, we need to know so we can keep you safe." His words were gentle, filled with compassion, but Sarah's face hardened, her jaw setting in defiance. "I can't say," she repeated, her voice firmer this time, as if she were determined to carry the weight of her secret no matter the cost. The nurse tried a different approach, her voice softening as she addressed Sarah. "Sometimes, it helps to talk about things. You don't have to do this alone," she said, her eyes warm and understanding. But Sarah just looked down, her shoulders curling inward protectively. She had been holding onto her secret for so long, hiding it away in the darkest corners of her heart, and now the fear of letting it out threatened to overwhelm her. The truth, she knew, would bring a storm she wasn't sure she could survive. After a long silence, the doctor rose, instructing the nurse to take the baby to the pediatric unit for a full examination. He watched as Sarah's eyes followed the nurse, her face etched with a mixture of longing and worry as the infant disappeared down the hallway. Left alone in the sterile room, she felt the walls close in, her secret pressing down on her like a weight she could no longer bear. Sarah sat alone in the examination room, her small frame barely filling the edge of the oversized chair. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the door where the nurse had disappeared with the baby. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, stretching the silence around her as fear gnawed at her insides. She had fought so hard to protect him, to keep everything hidden. Now, sitting under the bright, sterile lights of the hospital, she felt as though her entire world was unraveling. The door opened quietly, and the nurse re-entered the room, giving Sarah a warm, reassuring smile. "The doctors are taking care of him, Sarah," she said gently, pulling a chair closer to sit beside her. "He's in good hands." Sarah nodded, her gaze falling to the floor as she felt a surge of relief mixed with fresh anxiety. The thought of being without him, even for a few moments, left her feeling empty. It was as if a part of her had been taken away. After a pause, the nurse spoke again, her tone gentle but insistent. "Sarah, I know you're very brave, and I know you've done so much on your own. But we need to understand what happened so we can help both of you. Can you tell me more about yourself? Where do you live?" Sarah's face tightened as she stared down at her hands, fiddling with the sleeve of her worn sweater. Every question chipped away at the wall she had built around herself, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it up. I live with my mom," she whispered, the words coming out slowly as if each one was a confession. Her voice was barely above a murmur, but the nurse leaned in, listening closely, piecing together Sarah's guarded replies. "And your father?" the nurse asked cautiously, sensing that the question might be delicate. Sarah shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. He's not around," she replied, her voice distant, as though even thinking about him was painful. The nurse nodded gently, her heart aching for the little girl before her, who looked so vulnerable yet so resolute. She was clearly carrying a weight far too heavy for someone her age. The nurse's instincts told her that there was more to the story, that beneath Sarah's silence was a pain that ran deep. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she could see that Sarah's defenses were still firmly in place. She didn't want to push too hard, knowing that trust was fragile and would have to be earned slowly. The doctor re-entered the room, his face serious yet calm. He knelt down beside Sarah, looking at her kindly. "The baby is stable, Sarah. He's a little underweight, but we're giving him everything he needs. You did a very good job taking care of him." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed his words, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding over her. She had done everything she could, yet standing here, she wondered if it had ever been enough. The baby had been her secret, her responsibility, and now, for the first time, it was out of her hands. The doctor continued gently, his voice soft but firm. "Sarah, it's important that we understand your situation. I know it's hard, but you're safe here. No one will hurt you. Can you tell us who the baby's father is?" His question hung in the air, heavy with implication, but Sarah's face hardened immediately. She shook her head, her eyes filling with defiance. "No," she replied firmly, each letter of the word packed with resistance. "I won't say. It doesn't matter." The nurse and doctor exchanged worried glances, each realizing the depth of Sarah's determination. There was a strength in her, an iron resolve that went beyond her years. They sensed that whatever truth she was hiding was something she had been holding onto for a long time, and it wouldn't be easily uncovered. The nurse leaned forward, her voice warm. "Sometimes secrets feel safer when they're kept inside, but they also grow heavier. You don't have to carry this alone, Sarah." But Sarah only looked away, biting her lip as she fought to keep her composure. She felt as though the walls around her were cracking, that every question was a blow chipping away at her carefully built defenses. She wanted to believe them, wanted to feel safe. But she couldn't risk it. She had made a promise, one she couldn't break, and she clung to it, refusing to let herself falter. The truth was something she couldn't afford to share, Not now, not ever. The examination room felt colder and smaller with each passing moment, the walls closing in as Sarah remained silent, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. She sensed the worried glances between the doctor and the nurse, felt their unspoken questions hovering in the air, yet she couldn't bring herself to answer. How could they possibly understand? She was just 11, but the weight of the secret she carried felt heavy enough to crush her. Her mind drifted back to the past months, each memory another layer of the pain she had buried deep inside. In her mind, Sarah returned to the countless nights she'd spent alone in her room, trying to care for the baby by herself. She remembered holding him close, singing softly to calm his cries, even as fear and exhaustion gnawed at her. There were nights when she would stay up, watching over him as he slept, her heart pounding with dread every time he whimpered or stirred. She had been terrified of someone finding out, of her secret life coming to light. And yet, she hadn't been able to bring herself to give him up. Somehow, she had felt that it was her duty to protect him, no matter what it cost her. The nurse noticed the distant look in Sarah's eyes and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, bringing her back to the present. "Sarah, you don't have to face this alone," she said softly. "I know you're scared, but we're here to help you, not to hurt you." Her tone was filled with warmth, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt the urge to let her guard down, to tell them everything. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, the fear returned, wrapping around her heart like a vice. She couldn't betray her promise, she couldn't risk what little safety she had left. The doctor watched Sarah carefully, noticing the flicker of emotion that crossed her face before she withdrew into herself again. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the internal battle she fought with every word they spoke. "Sarah," he began gently, choosing his words with care, "sometimes, the truth can feel like a burden too heavy to carry alone. But I promise you, telling us won't make things worse. It might even help." He waited, hoping for some response, but Sarah's gaze remained firmly fixed on the floor, her silence louder than words. As the moment stretched, Sarah felt the urge to cry building inside her. She hadn't cried since the night the baby had come into her life, hadn't allowed herself to feel the depth of her own pain. She had been too busy surviving, too focused on keeping her secret safe. But now, sitting here under the concerned eyes of strangers, she felt cracks forming in the wall she had built around herself. Her lip trembled, and she quickly bit down on it, determined not to let the tears escape. The nurse noticed the slight tremor in Sarah's shoulders and reached out again, her voice gentle. "It's okay to be scared, Sarah. It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. You don't have to be strong all the time." But Sarah only shook her head, a single tear escaping despite her efforts to hold it back. She brushed it away quickly, frustrated with herself for showing weakness. Strength was all she had left, and even that felt like it was slipping away. The doctor sighed, his heart heavy as he watched this young girl struggle under a weight she shouldn't have to bear. He glanced at the nurse, both of them feeling helpless, knowing that Sarah's silence came from a place of deep pain. "Sarah," he tried once more, his voice filled with kindness, "we're not here to take anything from you. We just want to help. Can you tell us a little about the baby? How you met him, maybe? Anything you feel comfortable sharing?" Sarah swallowed, her throat tight as she thought about how much she could say without giving herself away. He came into my life suddenly," she murmured, choosing her words carefully. "And he didn't have anyone. No one to protect him." Her voice grew softer with each word, as if she was speaking more to herself than to them. "I thought, if no one else could be there for him, maybe I could be." The nurse's eyes filled with sadness as she listened, realizing that Sarah had taken on a role no child should have to fill. She reached out, taking Sarah's hand in her own, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're very brave, Sarah," she said quietly. "But bravery doesn't mean you have to carry this all by yourself. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let others in." Sarah looked at their joined hands, her chest tightening with a longing for comfort, for safety, for something she hadn't felt in a very long time. But as much as she wanted to believe them, as much as she wanted to trust, Sarah knew that trust came with a price. She couldn't risk losing everything she had fought to protect, couldn't bear the thought of her life being torn apart by truths she wasn't ready to face. So she took a deep breath, forcing herself to pull away, wrapping her arms tightly around herself once more. The wall went back up, and she looked up at the doctor and nurse, her face a mask of defiance, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't tell you more. Please, just help him." Sarah sat in silence as the nurse and doctor shared a quiet glance, each deeply aware of the wall she had built around herself, a wall they couldn't force their way through. Yet, they also saw the fragility beneath her defiance, the way her hands trembled as she hugged herself, the flicker of fear in her eyes each time they asked about the baby. She was so young, too young to carry such heavy secrets. The nurse placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, hoping that even a small gesture might give her comfort. "We'll do everything we can to help him," she promised softly, her voice warm. "You've done so much already. You're not alone in this." But Sarah didn't respond. She just nodded, her gaze drifting to the floor. She wanted to believe the nurse's words, to let her guard down and accept the help that was being offered so kindly. But she couldn't shake the feeling that once she opened up, her world would come crashing down, and she couldn't risk that. She had worked too hard to keep everything hidden, to carry the weight by herself. She tightened her grip on her arms, as if holding herself together against the pull of their compassion. Outside the examination room, footsteps echoed down the hallway as the baby's cries faintly filled the air, muffled but distinct. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart pounding as she strained to listen, her entire body tense. The sound filled her with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that he was alive, that he was being taken care of. But fear too, because every moment he was here, their lives, her secret, was at risk. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone finding out, couldn't let herself imagine what would happen if her truth was exposed. The doctor noticed the way her eyes tracked the sound, her entire being focused on the faint wail. He knelt beside her, his face level with hers. "Sarah," he began gently, "I can see how much he means to you. You've protected him so fiercely. But you don't have to do this alone. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." He waited, hoping his words might pierce through her defenses, but Sarah's face remained unreadable, her expression guarded. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, afraid that if she did, he might see all the things she was trying so hard to hide. Her mind raced with memories, each one a reminder of why she couldn't let her guard down. She thought of the night she first held him, the tiny bundle that had changed her life overnight. She remembered the fear that had gripped her, the panic that had threatened to drown her. But alongside that fear had been a fierce, unbreakable bond, a connection she couldn't explain, one that made her promise herself that she would protect him no matter the cost. Now, standing on the edge of vulnerability, she feared that speaking would mean breaking that promise. The nurse, sensing that direct questions wouldn't get through to her, decided on a softer approach. "Sarah, do you know what's amazing?" she asked, her voice calm and inviting. Sarah looked up, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "What?" she asked hesitantly, curiosity breaking through her guarded expression. The nurse smiled gently. "The love you have for him. It's powerful, you know? It's what brought you here, what's keeping you going. And that kind of love deserves help, it deserves support. You don't have to protect him alone." The words struck a chord deep within Sarah, stirring emotions she had tried so hard to suppress. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it, and she quickly wiped it away, frustrated with herself for showing any weakness. She wanted to believe the nurse, wanted to let herself feel that it was okay to accept help. But the fear of what might happen, the fear of losing everything, still loomed large. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to. I don't know if I can." The doctor's heart ached as he saw her struggle, the inner conflict playing out on her young face. He wished he could take away her pain, wished there were words powerful enough to ease her burden. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're here to help you, not just him. Whatever you're carrying, whatever fear or pain, it's too much for one person to bear, especially someone as young as you. You've done so much already. You've been so brave. Let us be brave with you." For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. She felt the warmth of their words wrapping around her, soothing her fear, even if only slightly. But still, her mind raced, clinging to the fear of what could happen if she let down her guard. She wanted to trust them, to let herself believe that they would help her without tearing apart everything she had worked to protect. But the thought of the truth slipping out, the thought of exposing herself and him to the scrutiny of others, was almost too much to bear. The nurse gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, her eyes filled with understanding. "Whenever you're ready, Sarah," she said softly, "we're here. There's no rush. Take your time. And know that no matter what, you've done something extraordinary. You brought him here. You took care of him when no one else could. That's a powerful thing." Sarah nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and despair, each word bringing her closer to the breaking point. And as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet support of these strangers, a small part of her began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. Sarah sat alone in the examination room once more, the gentle words of the nurse echoing in her mind, making her feel a mixture of comfort and confusion. She had always believed that silence was her only protection, that the more she kept hidden, the safer they would both be. Yet, for the first time, she was starting to feel cracks in her resolve. The warmth of the nurse's kindness, the doctor's gentle encouragement, they felt like lifelines, like a chance to ease the weight she had carried alone for so long. But letting go of even a small part of her secret felt terrifying, like stepping off a ledge with no idea what awaited her below. She stared at her hands, her fingers twisting and fidgeting as she thought of the baby, alone somewhere in the hospital, surrounded by strangers. The emptiness in her arms was almost unbearable, and she realized just how deeply connected she felt to him. She had tried so hard to keep her emotions in check, to be strong and unwavering. But here, surrounded by the sterile walls of the hospital, her defenses felt thin, like a fragile barrier barely holding back a flood of feelings she didn't know how to handle. The door opened, and the nurse entered again, her expression warm and gentle as she approached Sarah. She sat down beside her, folding her hands in her lap as if she were just a friend coming to sit and chat. "Sarah, I just checked in on him," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "He's resting now, and he's safe." Sarah's chest tightened at the mention of the baby, relief flooding her even as worry continued to gnaw at her. She nodded, her gaze still fixed on her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The nurse continued, her tone soft and inviting. "You've taken such good care of him, Sarah. You should be proud of yourself." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and guilt at the words, her heart tugged in two directions. She knew she had done her best, but it felt like a hollow achievement. After all, she had kept him hidden, unable to offer him the safety and stability he deserved. The nurse's kindness only made her feel the weight of her inadequacies more keenly. I didn't know what else to do," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. The nurse nodded, understanding shining in her eyes. "Sometimes, we do the best we can, even if it feels like it's not enough," she said gently. "But you brought him here. You cared for him when no one else could. That's something no one can take away from you." Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to let her emotions betray her, but the nurse's words were slowly breaking down the walls she had built so carefully. She felt raw, vulnerable in a way that scared her. The nurse continued, her voice soothing. "You know, you're still a child yourself, Sarah. You shouldn't have to carry this alone. Sometimes, adults don't always make the right choices. Sometimes they leave things behind that they shouldn't." Sarah's heart clenched at the mention of adults, her mind immediately flashing back to the figure she had avoided mentioning, the person whose existence she kept hidden even from herself. She couldn't speak about him, couldn't bring herself to even think his name. The nurse must have sensed her discomfort, because she didn't press further. Instead, she shifted the conversation slightly. "If you ever feel ready to share more, we're here to listen. But if you just want to sit quietly, that's okay too. We're not here to rush you." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the nurse's patience, a warmth that eased some of the fear gnawing at her. She took a deep breath, her heart racing as she considered the possibility of speaking, of letting out even a small part of the truth. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling to find words that felt safe, words that wouldn't expose too much. Finally, she settled on a vague confession. I didn't want him to be alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I couldn't just leave him. He didn't have anyone." Her words hung in the air, fragile but deeply felt. The nurse nodded slowly, compassion radiating from her as she listened without judgment. "You're a very brave girl, Sarah," she said, her tone gentle. "You have a heart full of love, and that's a gift." Sarah blinked, her vision blurring as the tears she had tried so hard to hold back spilled over. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed but unable to stop. The nurse didn't react, allowing her the space to feel without intrusion, without prying. The silence felt safe, a moment where she could simply be a child, lost and hurting, without the need to explain herself. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the faintest hint of hope, a glimmer of something warm and reassuring. As the nurse stood to leave, she placed a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll take care of him, Sarah. And we'll take care of you, too," she promised, her voice filled with sincerity. "No matter what you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Sarah watched her leave, a small part of her wishing she could believe those words, wishing she could let go of the secrets she had buried so deep. But as the door closed, she remained silent, the weight of her past pressing down on her, unwilling to let her heart open just yet. The minutes dragged by after the nurse left, and Sarah found herself alone in the sterile, silent examination room once more. She curled up on the chair, her knees tucked against her chest as she stared blankly at the walls, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't contain. A hollow ache pulsed in her chest, a heaviness she couldn't shake. She felt as if the walls were closing in on her, each inch of sterile, white space a reminder of how trapped she was. She wanted to be anywhere but here, to disappear with her secret and her baby, far away from questions she couldn't answer. She thought back to the first night she'd held the baby in her arms. It was dark, and she'd been alone, save for the tiny, vulnerable life she now found herself responsible for. That night, she had felt both terrified and powerful, holding him close as if she could shield him from every danger in the world. In those moments, she had made a promise to herself, a promise to protect him no matter what, to keep him safe and loved, even if that meant carrying the burden alone. That promise had given her strength on nights when she wanted to break, and yet now, it was the very thing tearing her apart. The sound of footsteps outside the room broke her from her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Her heart leapt into her throat, fearing that someone would come in with more questions, more prying. She didn't know how much longer she could hold up under their kind but probing eyes. She had kept this secret for so long, and the idea of letting it slip, even a little, felt like tearing open a wound that would never heal. She hugged her knees tighter, willing herself to stay strong, to keep everything buried. But even as she tried to build her defenses, the cracks were widening. She thought about the nurse's words, the gentle promise that she didn't have to carry this alone. Part of her yearned to believe it, to let someone in, if only to ease the loneliness that gnawed at her heart. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had seen too much, learned too early that people weren't always who they seemed to be. She couldn't risk letting her guard down, not when everything she held dear depended on her silence. The door creaked open again, and this time it was the doctor. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him as he approached her. Sarah tensed, her hands gripping her knees even tighter, her eyes wary. But the doctor simply pulled up a chair beside her, his movements slow and gentle. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence settle between them in a way that felt almost comforting. Sarah watched him out of the corner of her eye, unsure of what he wanted or if he was about to ask her more questions. After a moment, he spoke, his voice calm and reassuring. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know that the baby is doing okay. He's stable, and he's in good hands." Relief washed over her, but it was quickly followed by a sharp pang of guilt. She nodded, her throat tight with unspoken words. She didn't know how to thank him, didn't know if she even deserved to feel relief after all she had put the baby through. She had done her best, but she knew it hadn't been enough. The thought tore at her heart, making her feel small and powerless. The doctor continued, his tone soft. "You're very brave, Sarah, braver than many adults I know. But bravery doesn't mean you have to face everything alone." She felt his gaze on her, gentle but intense, as if he could see straight through her defenses. She looked away, afraid that if she met his eyes, he would see everything she was hiding. She didn't want his sympathy, it only made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. But his words echoed in her mind, stirring something deep within her, a longing she couldn't ignore. "Sometimes," he went on, "we think keeping secrets will protect us. But in reality, they can keep us locked away, unable to truly be free." Sarah's chest tightened as he spoke, each word striking a chord she couldn't ignore. She had never thought of her secret as a cage, but now, sitting here, she realized just how trapped she felt. She was bound by the fear of what might happen if the truth came out, unable to live freely or breathe easily. She had built her life around silence, and now, for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to live without that burden. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. The doctor pretended not to notice, giving her space to feel without judgment. His patience, his quiet compassion, it was both comforting and terrifying. She wanted to speak, to let out even a small piece of the truth, but fear held her back. She didn't know where to start or if she would ever be able to stop once she began. The doctor stood up, sensing her inner conflict. "Take your time, Sarah. We're here whenever you're ready," he said, his voice filled with understanding. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, the warmth of his touch grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. As he left the room, Sarah sat there in silence, his words lingering in the air like a quiet invitation. For the first time, she considered the possibility of letting someone in, of sharing the weight she had carried alone for so long. But even as hope flickered within her, fear clung to her heart, a reminder of all she stood to lose if she let go of her silence. The minutes dragged by, and Sarah sat motionless, her mind racing in circles. The doctor's words replayed in her head, stirring up emotions she had long tried to bury. "We think keeping secrets will protect us, but they can keep us locked away." She hadn't thought of her silence as a prison before, but now, alone in the sterile, quiet room, she felt its weight more than ever. She thought of all the nights she had spent awake, keeping watch over the baby, her secret, her responsibility. Her heart ached with a mixture of love and fear that made her feel so much older than she was, a child forced to shoulder burdens far beyond her years. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to the days before she had come to the hospital, the days when she had tried desperately to manage everything on her own. She thought of the moments when the baby's cries had pierced the quiet of the night, the panic that would rise in her chest as she tried to soothe him. She had barely known what to do, improvising each step along the way, hoping and praying that she was doing enough. She remembered the worry that had kept her up at night, the constant fear that she was failing him, that he deserved better than the fractured life she could provide. The hospital, with its gentle nurses and calm doctors, had shown her a different world, one where people cared without judgment, where there was help without questions, warmth without cost. Yet the fear of what might happen if she trusted them still held her back, tightening like a knot in her chest. She had spent so long protecting her secret that the idea of letting it out felt terrifying, as though it would break her open, exposing parts of herself that she couldn't bear for anyone to see. The thought left her feeling small and vulnerable, her carefully constructed walls quivering under the pressure. The door opened again, and this time, a social worker entered, her smile kind and warm. She introduced herself as Ms. Parker, her voice soft as she approached Sarah with cautious steps. Sarah felt her defenses rise immediately, her body tensing as if bracing for a blow. She hadn't expected someone new, and the presence of this unfamiliar figure only heightened her anxiety. Ms. Parker seemed to sense her discomfort, and she kept a respectful distance, settling into the chair across from Sarah with a gentle smile. "Hi, Sarah," Ms. Parker greeted, her tone casual, inviting. "I know this is a lot to deal with, and you must be feeling overwhelmed. I just want you to know that I'm here to support you, however you need." She didn't press for information, didn't ask any questions right away. Instead, she simply waited, allowing Sarah to take in her presence without pressure. It was a simple gesture, but Sarah felt a small wave of relief, a reminder that she was not being forced into anything. After a few moments of silence, Ms. Parker spoke again, her voice calm and steady. "You're not alone, Sarah. There are people who want to help you, people who care about you and the baby. Whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it by yourself." Sarah looked up, meeting Ms. Parker's eyes, and saw nothing but genuine concern reflected back at her. She felt her heart flutter with a strange mixture of hope and fear, a tug-of-war between the desire to trust and the instinct to protect herself. Ms. Parker leaned forward slightly, her expression empathetic. Sometimes, when we carry things by ourselves, they can feel much heavier than they really are. But sharing a little bit of that burden can make it easier to breathe, easier to feel like yourself again. Her words were soft, gentle, weaving their way into Sarah's heart like a quiet invitation. Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat, tangled up with her fear and uncertainty. She could feel the urge to tell them something, anything, building within her, but she was paralyzed by the risk. She wanted to believe that Ms. Parker's kindness was real, that she could trust her with at least a piece of the truth. She imagined what it might be like to release even a fragment of her secret, to let someone else help carry the weight she had shouldered for so long. But every time she considered speaking, a wave of panic surged within her, pulling her back, locking her words away. She couldn't shake the fear that opening up would lead to consequences she couldn't control, that her small world would shatter if she let down her guard. Ms. Parker gave her an encouraging smile, her patience unyielding. "There's no rush, Sarah. We'll be here as long as you need us. Just know that whatever you decide to share, it will stay safe with us. You don't have to say anything until you're ready." The reassurance in her voice was like a balm, soothing the fear that clawed at Sarah's heart. She took a shaky breath, her resolve wavering as she felt the warmth of Ms. Parker's words wrapping around her like a blanket. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just hard. I don't know if anyone would understand." She looked away, biting her lip as fresh tears gathered in her eyes. She didn't know how to explain the complexity of her situation, the conflicting feelings that had haunted her for so long. Ms. Parker nodded, her gaze soft and understanding. Sometimes, when things feel too big to say, it helps to start with just one small piece. You don't have to tell the whole story right away. Just one piece at a time. Sarah sat in silence, Ms. Parker's gentle words hanging in the air like a lifeline she wasn't sure she was ready to grab. The social worker's encouragement was soft, unobtrusive, giving Sarah the space to process without pressure. For the first time, Sarah felt that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this all alone. Ms. Parker's presence was calming, and her patient gaze held no judgment, only understanding. Taking a deep breath, Sarah fought the instinct to retreat, feeling the fragile walls around her start to crack. The moments stretched as Sarah struggled within herself. Her heart pounded as she considered the possibility of letting go, even a little, of the secret she had held so tightly. She looked at her hands, twisting them nervously, feeling the weight of everything she had been holding in. She thought of the baby, his tiny, vulnerable body, and the way he had clung to her, how he had given her a purpose she hadn't known she needed. She felt an overwhelming love and fear for him, an intensity that both grounded her and tore her apart. Ms. Parker noticed the turmoil flickering across Sarah's face, sensing that the young girl was at a tipping point. She leaned forward slightly, her tone as soft as ever. "You don't have to do this alone, Sarah," she repeated. "Whatever you're holding on to, we're here to help you carry it. You've been so strong, but it's okay to let someone else be strong with you." Her voice was a gentle invitation, one that wrapped around Sarah like a protective blanket, softening the sharp edges of her fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah let out a shaky breath. Her voice was barely above a whisper, each word a painful release. He's my brother," she began, her voice trembling as she spoke. It wasn't the full truth, but it was a piece of it, something small enough to share without feeling completely exposed, yet big enough to ease a part of her burden. Ms. Parker nodded, her expression open and accepting, as if every word Sarah spoke mattered. "Your brother," she repeated softly, encouraging her to continue at her own pace. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she clung to the story she had created, the one she told herself to make everything seem bearable. She had always thought of the baby as her brother in a way, someone she needed to protect, someone who was part of her in a way she couldn't explain. "I had to take care of him," she continued, her voice breaking. "There was no one else. I didn't want him to be alone." The words came out in a rush, a flood of emotion she hadn't known she was holding back. She was finally sharing something, even if it wasn't the full truth. It felt both terrifying and liberating. Ms. Parker's face softened as she listened, nodding in understanding. "That's a lot for someone so young to take on," she said gently. "But it sounds like you've done everything you could to protect him." "That's incredibly brave, Sarah." Her words felt like a balm, easing some of the shame and fear that had weighed Sarah down. It was strange to feel pride instead of guilt, to feel like maybe she had done something right, even in the middle of all this confusion and pain. Sarah sniffled, wiping a tear from her cheek as she tried to regain her composure. "I just didn't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I still am." She felt raw, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Miss Parker placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, her touch light and reassuring. "It's okay to be scared, Sarah," she said softly. "It's okay to feel everything you're feeling. You're not alone in this, not anymore." The words hit Sarah like a gentle wave, washing over her with a mixture of comfort and fear. She had lived in isolation for so long, built her life around the walls she had created to protect herself and the baby. But here was someone willing to share the weight, someone who seemed to care without demanding anything in return. For the first time, Sarah felt the smallest sliver of hope that maybe things could be different, that she didn't have to hide forever. Ms. Parker didn't push further, didn't ask for more details than Sarah was ready to give. Instead, she simply stayed with her, offering quiet companionship in the midst of Sarah's turmoil. Sarah felt her defenses begin to crumble, the walls she had built shaking under the weight of her emotions. She still couldn't bring herself to tell the whole truth, not yet. But this moment, this connection, felt like a small step toward healing, like she was finally beginning to let someone in, even if only a little. As they sat in silence, Sarah took a deep breath, her heart beating slightly slower as a sense of calm settled over her. She didn't know what would happen next or how much she could reveal. But sitting beside Miss Parker, she felt, for the first time in a long time, that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. The hours that followed were a strange blend of relief and uncertainty for Sarah. She had opened a tiny door to her truth, letting Miss Parker in just a little, yet even that small confession had left her feeling exposed, as if she were balancing on the edge of a cliff. She could still hear Miss Parker's gentle voice in her mind, telling her that it was okay to be scared, that she didn't have to face everything alone. Those words had brought her comfort in the moment, but now, as she sat alone again, fear began to creep back in, tugging at the edges of her newfound hope. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of her secret pressing down on her once more. She thought about the baby, her brother, as she had called him to Ms. Parker. Protecting him had become her mission, her reason for every choice she had made, but now she wondered if that protection had come at a cost she hadn't anticipated. She had spent so long hiding, so long convincing herself that silence was safety, that she was beginning to question if she even knew how to let anyone in. The thought of giving up control over their lives filled her with a sense of dread. The door creaked open, and Miss Parker entered again, this time carrying a small tray with food, a sandwich, some fruit, and a juice box. She placed it on the small table beside Sarah, her smile warm and understanding. "I thought you might be hungry," she said softly. Sarah realized with a pang that she hadn't eaten all day, the tension and fear overshadowing her basic needs. She managed a small nod, reaching for the sandwich, though her hands trembled slightly as she took it. Ms. Parker sat down beside her, not saying anything, just offering her quiet presence. As she ate, Sarah felt her shoulders relax, even if only slightly. Ms. Parker's patience was comforting, her silence a reminder that Sarah didn't have to speak until she was ready. They sat in a companionable silence, and Sarah found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of safety, of being cared for. She had always been the one caring for the baby, the one making all the decisions, carrying all the burdens. The simplicity of someone looking out for her, even in this small way, was like a balm to her frayed nerves. After a few minutes, Ms. Parker spoke, her voice gentle and non-intrusive. "Sarah, I know you've been through a lot. You've shown so much strength and resilience, more than anyone could ever ask of you." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But you don't have to do this by yourself anymore. There are people who can help both you and the baby, people who want to make sure you're both safe and cared for." Her words were spoken with such sincerity that Sarah felt her heart ache, torn between trust and fear. Sarah set down her half-eaten sandwich, her appetite fading as her emotions rose to the surface. She wanted to believe Ms. Parker, to let go of the burden she had carried alone for so long, but she couldn't shake the lingering doubt that kept her silent. What if they take him away?" she whispered, barely able to voice her deepest fear. The thought of losing the baby, of being separated from the one person she had fought so hard to protect, was unbearable. She looked down, her fists clenched, bracing herself against the fear that gripped her heart. Ms. Parker's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "We're not here to take him away from you, Sarah. We're here to make sure you both have what you need, to help you find a way forward that keeps you both safe. No one wants to separate you from him, not if we can help it." Her voice was filled with conviction, a steady promise that Sarah wanted desperately to believe. She could feel her resolve wavering, the possibility of trusting Ms. Parker beginning to feel real. Taking a deep breath, Sarah felt her heart race, her mind caught between hope and fear. She knew that opening up fully was the only way forward, that if she continued to keep her secret, she would remain trapped, both her and the baby confined by her silence. She looked up at Ms. Parker, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know how to let go," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been hiding for so long. I thought it was the only way to keep him safe." Ms. Parker nodded, her gaze understanding. "You've done everything you could to protect him, Sarah. And you should be proud of that. But sometimes, letting go isn't about giving up control, it's about allowing others to help, to make the weight a little lighter." She paused, giving Sarah a small, encouraging smile. "You don't have to do it all at once. Just one step at a time." Her words were like a gentle nudge, pushing Sarah toward the edge of her fear, showing her a way forward that didn't feel as terrifying. Slowly, Sarah began to nod, a glimmer of acceptance in her eyes. She still didn't know if she was ready to reveal everything, but Miss Parker's kindness and patience were breaking down her defenses bit by bit. She took a shaky breath, feeling a tentative sense of hope bloom within her. Maybe, just maybe, she could let go, just a little more, and see where it led. The decision to let someone in, even just a little, felt monumental for Sarah. Sitting there, looking into Ms. Parker's kind eyes, she felt the faintest glimmer of trust battling with her instinct to retreat. Ms. Parker's words had lingered in her mind, one step at a time. They were simple, but powerful, and they gave her a sense of control over a situation that had always felt so far beyond her grasp. For so long, she had believed that protecting her secret was her only power, the one thing she could do to ensure the baby's safety. Now, though, she wondered if her secrecy had been more of a shield against her own fears than true protection for him. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously, her heart pounding as she prepared to take the first step into an unknown future. I've been hiding because I thought that was the only way," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I kept him safe, kept everything to myself, no one could take him away." The words felt strange leaving her lips, like releasing a part of herself she hadn't known was trapped. Miss Parker's gaze was gentle, encouraging, her silence a reminder that Sarah could share at her own pace. Ms. Parker leaned in slightly, her expression open and patient, making no move to interrupt. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath and continued, the words spilling out slowly, as if each one were a piece of her guarded heart. He came into my life so suddenly, and I didn't know what to do, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I knew I couldn't leave him. I had to protect him, to be there when no one else would. Her voice wavered, and her gaze dropped to the floor as she struggled to hold back the tears welling in her eyes. The social worker reached out, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "You've done so much, Sarah," she said softly, her tone filled with admiration. "More than anyone could ever expect of someone your age. It's clear how much you care for him." The words felt like a balm to Sarah's heart, easing some of the tension that had been knotted there for so long. She had always felt guilty, wondering if she was enough, if her efforts to care for him had been sufficient. But here was someone telling her that she had done well, that her love and care had made a difference. Feeling slightly more secure, Sarah allowed herself to take a small leap. "I call him my brother," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "But he's not really." Her confession hung in the air, vulnerable and raw, but Miss Parker's expression didn't change. There was no shock, no judgment, just a deep compassion in her gaze that told Sarah it was okay to keep going. "It's complicated," Sarah continued, the words tumbling out now as if they had been waiting for years to be spoken. I don't really know what else to call him. His part of me. And I couldn't let him go." Ms. Parker nodded, her understanding unwavering. "He's important to you, I can see that," she said softly. "Sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about love and connection. And it sounds like he's your family." The validation brought a fresh wave of emotions to Sarah, her heart both heavy and light at the same time. She had always felt like she was doing something wrong, that her attachment to him was somehow a flaw. But Miss Parker's words reassured her that her love for him was valid, that the bond she felt was real and meaningful. The weight of Sarah's confession filled the room, the silence deep and profound. She took another breath, her hands gripping the edges of her chair as she prepared to reveal just a little more. "His father," she began, her voice faltering as she forced herself to say the words, "He doesn't know. I never told anyone. I was too afraid. I thought, if people knew, everything would fall apart." Her voice cracked, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek, the fear and isolation of the past months rushing back in vivid clarity. Ms. Parker's hand remained on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "You don't have to carry that fear alone anymore," she whispered, her voice gentle. "You're not alone, Sarah. We're here, and we'll do everything we can to keep both of you safe." The promise in her words, the commitment to stand by her, broke something open in Sarah. She felt the tightness in her chest ease, a small part of her finally daring to believe that maybe she could trust Ms. Parker, that maybe this support was real. Sarah's next words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't hold them back any longer. "His father, he's important. I don't think he'd want anyone to know." She looked down, the implications of her words weighing heavily between them. Ms. Parker's expression remained calm, though Sarah noticed a slight shift in her eyes, a glimmer of understanding as she pieced together what Sarah was saying. But the social worker didn't push, didn't pry for more details. Instead, she just nodded, acknowledging Sarah's fear without adding to it. For the first time, Sarah felt the full weight of what she had just shared, her heart pounding as she let herself lean into the possibility of trust. She had kept so much hidden, lived in fear for so long, but now, with Ms. Parker by her side, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there, a reminder that maybe she didn't have to face the future alone. She looked up, meeting Ms. Parker's gaze, and gave a tiny, hesitant nod, a silent promise that she was ready to take the next step, one piece at a time. After Sarah's quiet confession, the air in the room felt different, charged with a mixture of relief and tension. She had finally let go of the truth she'd been carrying alone for so long, even if only partially. She looked at Ms. Parker, who was watching her with unwavering empathy, her expression a silent promise that she would keep Sarah's secret safe. But even though Ms. Parker's gaze held nothing but understanding, Sarah felt a lingering fear gnawing at her, as if speaking even a sliver of her truth had set something irreversible in motion. Ms. Parker gave Sarah's shoulder a gentle squeeze, her warmth steadying. "Thank you for trusting me with that," she said softly, her tone sincere. "I know how hard it must have been to say. You don't have to tell me any more than you're comfortable with." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotions she didn't know how to release. She felt exhausted, as if finally speaking her truth had drained her of everything she'd held back. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange, unexpected lightness, like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had finally been lifted. Sarah looked down, fidgeting with the frayed edge of her sleeve. She wasn't used to this, having someone who listened without pushing, who allowed her to reveal things at her own pace. The thought of continuing to talk, of peeling back more layers, felt terrifying, but a part of her wanted to. She didn't know how to articulate it, but being in Miss Parker's presence made her feel, for the first time, that maybe she could share some of the pain she'd been holding on to. And maybe, just maybe, someone would be there to catch her if she let herself fall. Taking a shaky breath, Sarah spoke again, her voice a fragile whisper. "I didn't want him to be alone," she began, her words barely audible. I couldn't bear the thought of him growing up not knowing where he came from, not having anyone. I thought if I could just keep him with me, we'd be okay." Her voice wavered, and she felt her hands start to tremble. "But I was so scared that someone would find out, that they'd take him away. I kept everything hidden because I thought it was the only way." Ms. Parker nodded, her face soft with understanding. "You were doing what you thought was best, Sarah. And that's what makes you so brave. But bravery doesn't mean you have to bear it all on your own. You've been so strong for him, but it's okay to let others help you now." The gentle assurance in her words soothed some of Sarah's fears, allowing her to breathe a little easier. Ms. Parker's acceptance felt like a shelter, a place where Sarah could finally let her guard down without fear of judgment. As Sarah continued, she felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, each word revealing another layer of her struggle. "I know he deserves more than I can give him," she admitted, her voice thick with guilt. "He deserves a stable life, a home, people who can give him everything he needs. But I didn't know how to let go, how to let anyone else in. I thought, maybe if I could do it on my own, he wouldn't need anything else." The words tumbled out, raw and vulnerable, as she finally allowed herself to confront the impossible expectations she had placed on herself. Ms. Parker's eyes glistened with compassion as she listened, never interrupting, simply allowing Sarah to pour out her heart. "Sarah," she said gently, "the love you have for him is the best gift you could ever give. But love doesn't mean you have to do it all alone. It's okay to ask for support. It doesn't make you any less strong. In fact, sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let others in." Sarah felt her chest tighten, her emotions swirling as she absorbed Ms. Parker's words. The idea that she didn't have to carry the weight alone felt both terrifying and freeing. In the quiet that followed, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't always hiding, always afraid. She pictured a life where she could walk openly, without the constant burden of secrecy, where she and the baby could be safe together. The image felt distant, like a dream she didn't dare hope for, but Miss Parker's presence gave it a faint glimmer of possibility. For the first time, Sarah thought about the kind of future she wanted, not just for him, but for herself too. Her voice was hesitant as she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "If I let people help, does that mean I'll lose him?" The question was fragile, filled with fear and longing. She had fought so hard to keep him by her side, and the thought of being separated, of him slipping away from her life, was unbearable. She held her breath, waiting for Miss Parker's answer, fearing what she might say. Miss Parker's expression softened, and she gave Sarah a small, reassuring smile. "Not at all, Sarah," she replied gently. "Allowing people to help doesn't mean you'll lose him. It means you'll have more people who care about him, who want the best for both of you. You don't have to give up the connection you have with him. Instead, you'll have more people by your side, helping you keep that connection strong." Her words were like a balm to Sarah's fears, soothing the ache in her heart that had been building for so long. For the first time, Sarah felt a tentative sense of hope blooming within her, fragile but real. She took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in her chest begin to ease as she looked at Ms. Parker, her eyes filled with a cautious, hesitant gratitude. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, bit by bit, and while it was terrifying, it was also freeing. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know how much more she was ready to share, but for now, she had taken the first step. And with Ms. Parker by her side, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face it all alone. In the days that followed, Sarah felt like she was walking through a dream, both terrifying and beautiful in its unfamiliarity. She had spent so long living in silence, wrapped in the fear of discovery, that opening up had felt like stepping into the light for the first time. Ms. Parker had remained by her side, patient and kind, guiding her through each new revelation, each difficult memory, and each painful truth. Piece by piece, Sarah let her story unravel, revealing the layers of her struggle and love, her fears and hopes. The hospital became more than just a place of refuge. It transformed into a space of healing. Each day, Sarah visited the baby in the pediatric unit, her heart swelling with relief every time she saw him sleeping peacefully or reaching out with his tiny hands. Nurses smiled warmly as she entered, greeting her like she was part of the family. They could see the bond she shared with him, the fierce love she had carried in secret for so long, and their understanding gave her courage to keep moving forward. One afternoon, Ms. Parker pulled Sarah aside after a visit, her expression serious but hopeful. "Sarah," she began gently, "we've been working to make sure both of you will have a safe and stable home. We want to help you, not only for today but for the future. We found a way for you to stay together, with support, so you don't have to do this alone." Sarah's heart leapt, a mixture of hope and disbelief filling her. She hadn't dared to dream that they would allow her to keep him, to raise him, even with the support she so desperately needed. Ms. Parker's eyes softened, understanding the depth of Sarah's emotions. "You'll be placed in a home where you'll both have the care you need. There will be people to support you, to teach you, so you don't have to worry about carrying everything on your own." Sarah felt tears fill her eyes, the relief so overwhelming that she could hardly breathe. The life she had wanted for him, for both of them, was within reach, and it was as if the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders. They arranged for Sarah to visit the home she would soon move into, a warm, comfortable place where foster parents were ready to help her learn, to guide her as she took on the role she had fought so hard to keep. The couple greeted her with open arms, kindness shining in their eyes as they welcomed her and the baby into their lives. They didn't question her love for him or her desire to be part of his world. Instead, they celebrated it, seeing in her a strength and resilience that many adults would struggle to match. As the weeks passed, Sarah adjusted to her new life, allowing herself to relax, bit by bit, in the safety of her new home. The foster parents encouraged her to be with the baby as much as she wanted, supporting her with patience and love. She learned how to care for him with the guidance of those around her, slowly building confidence that she could indeed be what he needed. Her nights were no longer filled with fear, but with the gentle, comforting presence of people who truly wanted the best for both of them. One evening, as she rocked the baby to sleep, she felt a deep, quiet contentment settle within her. She watched his tiny chest rise and fall, marveling at how her world had shifted, how love had carried her through even her darkest days. She brushed a hand over his soft hair, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "We made it." For the first time, she felt that they were truly safe, that the future held hope instead of fear, that her love for him could grow in a place where it was supported, nurtured. Ms. Parker visited often, checking in on Sarah and the baby, and each time, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. Ms. Parker's kindness had given her courage, had shown her that trusting others could lead to freedom instead of pain. She would forever be thankful to Ms. Parker, who had seen the strength and love within her, who had given her the belief that she could build a future without secrets or shame. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Sarah sat with the foster parents and Miss Parker, all of them gathered in the living room as the baby gurgled happily in her lap. They talked about the future, about the next steps, about the possibilities for them both. As she looked around, surrounded by people who had become her family in every way that mattered, Sarah felt a sense of belonging, a peace that she hadn't known was possible. And as the baby clutched her finger, his tiny grip strong and sure, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with support, resilience, and the endless power of love. She had walked through shadows, carried her burdens alone, but now she had found her way into the light, and she was finally free to give him the life he deserved. With a heart full of gratitude and hope, she held him close, ready to embrace whatever the future would bring. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.